The Red Cross was renewing efforts to evacuate residents from the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol. According to Ukrainian authorities, 7 humanitarian corridors were being planned for today. Yesterday, the International Committee of the Red Cross sent a team to lead a convoy of about 54 Ukrainian buses and other private vehicles out of the city. But they turned back, saying conditions made it impossible to proceed. A convoy of buses carrying residents from Mariupol has reached the relative safety of the nearby city of Zaporizhzhia last night, but thousands are still trapped in the port city without access to food and water. Mariupol was encircled by Russian forces in the early days of the invasion and has been under relentless attack, leaving the city in ruins. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in an early morning video address that Russian troops have now moved towards the Donbas region and to the northeast towards Kharkiv, the country's second largest city. The United Nations Secretary General this week tapped the UN's chief humanitarian official to immediately work with the parties to bring the Ukraine conflict to an agreement towards a humanitarian ceasefire. Antonio Guterres also expressed hopes that Martin Griffiths, the UN's Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, would be able to travel to both Moscow and Kiev as soon as possible to engage directly with the leadership of both Russia and Ukraine. This as the organization's various agencies, from the World Food Programme to UNICEF, are warning of a catastrophic humanitarian situation unfolding in the country.
I've asked Martin Griffiths, the coordinator of our humanitarian work worldwide, immediately to explore with the parties involved the possible agreements and arrangements for a humanitarian ceasefire in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion 1 month ago, the war has led to the senseless loss of thousands of lives, the displacement of 10 million people, mainly women and children, the systematic destruction of essential infrastructure, and skyrocketing food and energy prices worldwide. This must stop.
Civilians in Ukraine desperately need this assistance and protection. But to do that, all parties must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to help civilians in their homes and those on the road in Ukraine, and to allow those civilians who want to leave to get out. We need detailed, realistic agreements on humanitarian ceasefires and pauses to allow aid in and people out.
We're talking about a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe, because Ukraine, from the breadbasket of the world now to bread lines, we never would have dreamed anything like this would be possible. And it's not just decimating dynamically Ukraine in the region, but it will have global context, impact beyond anything we've seen since World War II.
To discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and UN efforts to mitigate the impacts of this war, we speak now to the UN's resident and humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Osnat Lubrani, who joins us from Lviv in the western region of the country. Mr. Lubrani, good evening to you and welcome. You're on the ground in Ukraine. We understand that you led 2 of the most recent UN humanitarian convoys into some of the hardest hit areas of this conflict, but you say it's not enough. Give us a sense of the breadth of the situation facing the UN and its humanitarian partners in the country.
So, as was quoted by my colleagues, the Secretary General, the head of WFP, and the others, we're facing the fastest growing refugee and internally displaced crisis in Europe since World War II, and almost a quarter of the population of Ukraine. That's over 10 million have fled their homes. And so it's just a desperate situation, and Ukrainian people are really enduring a living hell and desperately need peace. And coming from the east, and I have to say, you know, this is a big country. I mean, South Africa is also a very big country, but this country is the size of France. So just coming from the east back to Lviv takes a day and a half of driving, and the situation of the besieged cities is really unimaginable. These are big cities with universities, with parks, with a thriving life that are all of a sudden demolished. And those who have been left there are really suffering. The biggest need is for medicine, for food, for urgent other humanitarian items, and that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to reach those in need, while, as you mentioned, the International Red Cross is trying to help people to open the corridors so that people can also evacuate.
I mean, time is everything in situations like these. And we heard the Secretary General, Martin Griffiths, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, to engage with parties to work out arrangements for a humanitarian ceasefire. What would a pause in fighting allow you to do? Because as we understand it, devastated towns and cities like Mariupol, Kherson and Chernihiv have yet to be reached by humanitarians. I think we've just lost our signal there temporarily. All right. Can you hear me, Ms. Lubrani? All right. We're going to try and reestablish contact with her there, but really trying to get a picture on the latest on what's happening with the humanitarian situation in the Ukraine. We were listening there to some of the efforts by the United Nations to mitigate the impacts of this war. UN humanitarian officials also raising concerns about the growing risk of trafficking, as well as sexual violence, exploitation and abuse in Ukraine and the wider region. That story for the latest on the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Ukraine. We're in conversation with the UN's resident and humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Osnat Lubrani, joining us from Lviv in the western region of the country. I was asking you, Ms. Lubrani, about the Secretary General tapping Martin Griffiths, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, to engage with parties to work out arrangements for a humanitarian ceasefire. And I think what's key is to ask, what would a pause in fighting allow you to do? Because as we understand it, you know, towns and cities like Mariupol, Kherson and Chernihiv, which are devastated, are yet to be reached by humanitarians.
So we very much hope that Martin Griffiths' efforts will help to ensure that there is safe passage, on the one hand, for the United Nations and its humanitarian partners to allow for absolutely vital, urgently needed, particularly medicines and food and water to enter these besieged towns. Those who are left are often the most vulnerable people that could not flee before. And they really are in a terrible situation. But on the other hand, also to ensure that those people that want to leave can evacuate safely in whichever direction they choose, and that is a real challenge right now. And I think that is what the United Nations is trying to do, to ensure that these agreements by all parties are secured, and that this can happen according to systems that we have in place, working in close cooperation with the ICRC.
So UN humanitarian officials are also raising concerns about the growing risk of trafficking and sexual violence, exploitation and abuse in Ukraine and the wider region. What is being done to mitigate the additional vulnerability that often face women and girls, specifically in these contexts?
So, you know, there is a concern, and I would say that this is in across the region, particularly with the refugee population comprised mostly of women and children, and that, of course, raises the risks of exploitation and abuse and trafficking. There are many organizations that are working hard to ensure prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse and to prevent trafficking, such as the International Organization for Migration, UNHCR, UN Women and other, and UN Population Fund are working all together. We're bringing expertise. We're using all of the lessons that we've learned in other crises and working a lot with the countries, the receiving countries, but also in Ukraine with the authorities, with the partners to put in systems in place for referral, for protection, and that is a very core. It is core to our all of our operations.
So for countries of the South, though, there's, of course, growing concern about the wider impacts of the conflict on wheat exports, sunflower seeds, energy costs, food security. The World Food Programme's David Beasley told the Security Council this week that while Ukrainian farmers are on the front lines fighting, planting season for corn and maize is imminent. What are you seeing and what are the implications?
My hope is that the planting season can still go forward. You know, I've just traveled a day and a half throughout Ukraine. It's a country. It's really you can see with your own eyes what a breadbasket it is. It's hours and hours of driving, and you see all of these fields that are not only feeding Ukraine, they're feeding the world. And it is going to be the impact of the crisis if the season cannot progress will go way beyond and already is going way beyond Ukraine in terms of driving prices up. But at the same time, there's still functioning systems and markets, and in spite of the conflict affecting many parts of the country, I think there are efforts, including by the United Nations and many of the partners, to try to ensure that the season can go on and that the impact will be lessened.
So, Ms. Lubrani, you've been based in Ukraine since 2018 after Crimea was annexed and the conflict in the Donbas in 2014, but before Russia's latest invasion of the country. And your role is, in the main, one of representing the Secretary General, supporting the country towards social and economic development to support democracy standards. What have the last 5 weeks done to Ukraine from a psychosocial and developmental perspective?
Look, it's been a shock for the people of Ukraine and also for all of us. It's we were talking about all of our focus was on advancing reforms for sustainable development, for advancing human rights, for achieving, getting this big country to move forward with prosperity, with really achieving and there are a lot of good practices in achieving international standards. So there has been, I have to say, since 2014, a very difficult crisis, but it was limited to 2 oblasts in eastern Ukraine. And so much of my focus had been also on that. But nationwide, we were really looking to hopeful that this conflict can be brought to an end and that the country can really move forward. So this is very sad that all of a sudden we have had to reshape our response to really help the entire country. It's 24 regions. And with an internally displaced population, with new challenges, and really shifting to humanitarian. At the same time, I want to say that we are not letting go of the focus on recovery, on development, on all of the gains that have been achieved. If this goes on, the estimate is that the country will lose 18 years of all of the progress that it has made in achieving the sustainable development goals. And we want to retain that. This is a country with a lot of capacities, with a lot of potential. And what they need most is really peace. And everyone needs peace. And the region needs peace. And the world needs peace because of the reason that you just said. I mean, this crisis has an impact everywhere, on South Africa, on all of the world.
So, given the sentiments that you've just expressed now, what would you love to see the parties agree to in the days ahead?
I think the parties need to come together. I think there needs to be a de-escalation. I think there needs to be dialogue. I think there needs to be, there is an over 700-kilometer border between Russia and Ukraine. There are important relationships. There are relationships of history, of culture, of language, and I think there is a lot of potential to build something positive and move forward. And I'm just really hopeful. I'm hopeful that there will be, and that Martin Griffiths and the United Nations and a lot of other partners who are friends of Russia and of Ukraine will be able to facilitate some solutions so that there will be a de-escalation, and that those innocent civilians that I've seen and these, that destruction of public infrastructure, of houses, of bridges, of that will take years to rebuild, that will stop, and that we can start working on a path to recovery and rebuilding and forging a positive way forward.
Osnat Lubrani, thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Appreciate your time. We can also appreciate the conditions under which you're doing your work and all of the experiences that you're witnessing and in which you're charged to really manage. So we wish you the best of luck under these trying circumstances. Osnat Lubrani is the UN's resident humanitarian